Hello, you're listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Mark Austin, and today we are talking about an election, not the UK election this time, but the one in South Africa that is taking place 30 years after the end of apartheid. Now, South Africa is a very special place to me. My daughter was born there. We lived there 30 years ago, and as a young family, on the day of the first ever election in which black people could vote, they did so with such excitement and optimism and hope. And we were filming there, of course, and we watched them queue for hours and hours, and the polling stations had to stay open way into the night. But they queued and they waited to get their first ever vote in a democratic election in South Africa. And afterwards I interviewed Mandela, and his dream, he said, was to create this rainbow nation.
Both black and white will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable right to human dignity. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world.
Such a big day for him, having been in prison for so long, imprisoned by the apartheid regime. And he said he wanted to create this special nation. He said it would take years, but don't judge us, he said, in 10 years. Judge us maybe in 20, certainly in 30. But after years of corruption and chronic unemployment and blackouts and violent crime, if the polls are right, the ANC's majority could be about to end. And our correspondent Yousra Elbagir joins me now from Johannesburg. So according to Nelson Mandela, Yousra, we can judge them now. And what is your judgment on how it's going?
Well, it's not great, Mark. We went to Nelson Mandela's home province, and it's actually the poorest province in the country, the Eastern Cape. We actually went to his hometown where he was buried. And the conditions there are dismal. People don't have running water. People are unemployed. They're hungry. The social relief grants that the ANC brought in post-COVID, 350 rand, very little money, around £15, is barely enough for them to feed themselves. So in that sense, in Mandela's own backyard, there hasn't been a lot to say in terms of how political freedom, democratic freedom, the right to vote, the right to live and move freely around their country actually translated into economic freedom, into empowerment that people can feel in their everyday lives. So the people we met in the Eastern Cape, many of them will still vote for the ANC out of sheer loyalty for Mandela, but younger people are starting to really feel a lot of cynicism towards this dream of a rainbow nation that they've been told about since they were younger, and who didn't live through 1994, who were born free and don't have that stark difference, or that, you know, the before and after, to really, they feel like, justify the bad governance that they've seen. I mean, we also went to Cape Town, the capital of the Western Cape, which is run by the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. And though Cape Town is one of the best run cities in the country, and service delivery, you know, rubbish collection, sanitation is all better than a majority of big cities across the country, we also saw really stark economic inequality. People living in shacks, squatters who've been living on privately owned land for 28 years, who haven't been able to kind of tap into city infrastructure, living just on the other side of Table Mountain to places like Camps Bay, where, you know, multi-million pound homes are being sold to people. So in the sense of unemployment, in the sense of crime and economic inequality, I think we are very far from the dream that Nelson Mandela had for the country, especially since he has been such, you know, a symbol of equality in all of its forms, not just racial equality, but economic empowerment and that move away from the poverty that he had so much disdain for.
You know, it's interesting. I wonder, given what you're saying, whether Mandela would be turning in his grave, because, you know, there were all these problems in the townships then, sanitation, you know, infrastructure problems, transport problems, power crises, which still there are power crises now. And then this corruption also chipping away at ANC approval ratings. I just wonder what he would be thinking.
I mean, that's come up a lot, and having discussions with friends who are South African who maybe feel a little bit distant from that memory of Nelson Mandela, who may feel like he gave up too much, that he compromised too much, I think are brought kind of back to reality when, people around who lived through that time speak about the possibility of civil war, speak about what was avoided and how important reconciliation was. But I think there are many moments where I personally feel like this seems so far from Mandela's vision, especially in terms of people's suffering, the everyday struggle people are going through, particularly Black South Africans. So when Nelson Mandela came into power in 1994, he brought in a national nutrition program, national school nutrition program, that made it mandatory for every state school to provide at least one meal for children, for school children. Some of the schools in Eastern Cape haven't offered school meals to children for 3 weeks, that are like living off of soup kitchens run by community volunteers. So it's kind of, there are two sides to this. There is the fact that the state has essentially failed in delivering on its promises, especially promises Mandela made about housing, about running water, about the basic human rights. But then there's also the resilience of the community in dealing with these problems. I think, that resilience that Mandela himself drew so much inspiration from.
It's interesting what you said about the generations and possibly the loyalty of older voters, loyalty to the ANC, and the younger people, that so-called born-free generation, maybe feel differently. Who could they vote for? Could they really turn their backs on the ANC?
I think many of them are turning their backs on the ANC. I don't think they see the ANC as this, liberation movement, this beacon of empowerment. They don't see it in the light that I think many older people see it, or even people who are from other African countries. I mean, I grew up hearing about the ANC, hearing about Mandela and Biko and O.R. Tambo and Winnie Mandela, and all they fought for was this template for Africans to really bring about the future they want for their countries in the face of oppressive regimes. I think that is almost irrelevant now for young people here in South Africa. What they're seeing is a lack of jobs. They're seeing an economic environment that is very difficult for them to access, that is predominantly white economic elite, and then a very few Black elite that are mostly political elite in the ANC and affiliates. And so they're seeing this and they're getting increasingly jaded. I mean, we spoke to a first-time voter, a 19-year-old in Alexandra, one of the oldest Black townships in the country. And she seemed very excited that her vote could bring a change, could bring a bright future for children. Her main concern was education. She said the education system is really bad. And she was standing in front of one of the oldest schools, pre-apartheid schools in Black areas. And I don't think she was even connected to that history behind her, that there were schools pre-apartheid that were, that there was a massive struggle or resistant movement to try and maintain and to make sure that education was still being provided for Black poor children in townships. There are options for them. I think the Economic Freedom Fighters, very radical Marxist party that talks about land reclamation, taking the land back from white people, they generally do have quite a young following, but we've also seen them lose potential voters to former President Jacob Zuma's new party, the MK party, which is in itself shocking, because he was the man who said that the ANC will rule until Jesus comes back, and then he's defected and formed his own party. But actually, the anti-establishment, disgruntled young person not able to get a job that would usually go for the Economic Freedom Fighters is now going for Jacob Zuma as this paragon of anti-establishment, anti-ANC rule, potentially, even though he's been deemed ineligible to run for a parliament seat because of his prison time.
I mean, it would be an absolute earthquake, wouldn't it? Even if the ANC lost their majority. I'm just looking here. 30 years ago, the ANC got 62% of the vote. I think their vote peaked in 2004, 67%. Now people are talking of below 50% for the first time.
It's really crazy. There's no precedent for this in South Africa's democratic history. Basically, the ANC will have to form a coalition. The DA, the Democratic Alliance, have signaled that they'd be open to forming a coalition with the ANC, which I think the ANC, I'd be very shocked if they considered that, considering it is led by a white man, John Steenhuisen. And I think they'd see that as some sort of shot to their credibility as a Black African liberation-based political movement. They could turn to smaller parties, but the ANC spokesperson did say they're not even considering it. She said, we're not even entertaining the thought. We're not discussing coalitions with anyone. We are really confidently working towards a majority. But if they drop below 50%, it is going to be a time of real uncertainty. And in the sense, the fact that the president's office put out a statement saying they've deployed 2,800 military personnel to assist South African police service in monitoring, maintaining law and order during the elections. I think they're very concerned about how this time of uncertainty could be exploited. And they're really positioning themselves to be prepared for a July 2021 riot scenario when
Really?
Zuma
Really?
was... There is that sense of they've made it clear that the police force is much more capable of dealing with that kind of threat of unrest. We have seen unrest across the country, which is, I've been told, very typical for election season. The Deputy Police Commissioner actually did say that they were watching around 600 polling stations that they see as high risk, 632 high-risk polling stations.
You know, I got a text yesterday from a friend in South Africa, a black guy who runs a small charity, and he texted me to say, he said, one of the problems is that the young have become disillusioned with democracy already because they think all it does is entrench the power of an elite, a black elite this time, not a white elite.
I mean, that's definitely there. 100% that is the sentiment. And I think also among kind of millennials, people my age, there's a sense that there's a real cynicism around the Mandela legacy and the fact that it hasn't brought the freedom that translates into people having access to economic success, wealth, equality. I mean, there are obviously like programs like Black Economic Empowerment that the Democratic Alliance actually has said that they would get rid of to make South Africa a more business-friendly environment. There are two things. There's the sense that the ANC hasn't lived up to the hype. It really is, they feel like it's overhyped, the Mandela legacy and the whole 1994 dream. But then I did meet a lot of people who feel very strongly about their vote, that they feel like their vote is their say, their vote is their way to actually change the landscape, to fix the things that they're unhappy with. There is the sanctity of democracy, I think, is still in place. But I will also say that only around 5 million young people between 18 and 29 years old registered to vote. So there will be disillusionment and apathy, but then on the other end of the spectrum, there is a sense that this is the only way to even bring about the change that they want.
Yousra, thanks very much indeed. We're just going to take a break, but we'll be back very shortly with more on the South African elections. Just a quick word on what it could all mean for South African foreign policy. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the ANC have become closely aligned with the so-called BRIC countries, including, of course, Russia and China. And I guess whatever the outcome, that ain't going to change. Yes,
I mean, we've seen South Africa capture the world's attention with their foreign policy, with BRICS, and they're leading this movement to challenge Western dominance with Russia and China and India. And then we've seen also South Africa take Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice. So the ANC's kind of internal politics, how they've always seen the world, has translated into their foreign policy because they will still have the largest share of seats in parliament, even if they don't have the majority. Like you said, that's not going to change. But one thing that I think is really interesting is the fact that actually the ANC's foundational principles, the internationalism, the Pan-Africanism, the non-tribalism, non-racial based order is still unique in the fact that no other party in the sphere has managed to kind of challenge how much it's shaped South African history and South African society. The fact that this is a country with so many tribal groups and doesn't suffer from the issues of tribalism that other countries in Africa do, my own included in Sudan. So I think in that sense, the way South Africa sees itself and the way South Africa approaches the world is so shaped by ANC policy and the Mandela era of liberation and political engagement and how South Africa presented itself to the world at that time in 1994. And I think if it were to change, a lot of people who may not want to vote for the ANC today will regret not supporting the ANC.
And I mean, Mandela, as I was saying at the beginning, spoke of this, this dream of a rainbow nation where everybody was represented, everybody had a say, everybody was equal. But I mean, it remains, doesn't it, one of the most unequal nations on earth. So I guess the question, has this hope just evaporated? Has the optimism evaporated? Or is it just, now just politics as it is in any other country?
I think in many ways, the Rainbow Nation ideal has come to life in the sense of so many people can feel at home here. I think as a country, even just moving here, and I don't know how it was for you, Mark, I have never felt so at home in a place where there are just so many people from around the world, but even within the country, so many racial groups, so many tribal groups, and a sense that everyone feels at home, I think is very rare, and it's beautiful. But I also see how that division is internalized, economic inequality is internalized, where there is a lot of xenophobia, especially towards working class, undocumented migrants from surrounding countries, from Zimbabwe, from Malawi, Mozambique. There's a real sense that people are coming in during a time of scarcity and taking the little they have. And we hear that a lot in townships like Alexandra. Now, there are a lot of parties that are trying to exploit that fear, that xenophobia, that, going for the populist route. And it's actually not uncommon. Some of the bigger parties have done that as well. And the ANC has pointed towards tightening border control and tightening its, really being more rigid in its stance towards migration in an effort to get more votes. So in a lot of ways, yes. But I think the economic inequality has undermined that vision in a big way because people feel very cornered. And when you're cornered and when things aren't going well, you're not going to feel the spirit of the Rainbow Nation necessarily.
I mean, you ask how we felt about the country. I mean, my daughter was born there in 94, actually. And my wife was working as a doctor in Baragwanath Hospital, which is, as you know, the massive hospital in Soweto. But there was this violence in the townships going on between the ANC and the Zulu parties. And that there was just this level of crime that was obviously born out of the inequality that existed. And the crime was just awful. And I just wonder, is that changed? Or is there still that level of crime to go along with the sort of political crime, the corruption that's going on?
There is a lot of crime. Petty crime, extreme kind of brutal crime. Murder rates are really high. The murder rates in Western Cape have increased by over 9%, I think, every year for a few years now. Cape Town is still the murder capital of one of the murder capitals of the world. Every other day, someone gets hijacked in Johannesburg. I think when people were voting, it was really interesting because some people were voting to get a job. But then I found that, young women are voting to feel safe, especially with power cuts, crime that already was rife, it's just going through the roof. Speaking to people and feeling like they're voting to see very tangible things change in their everyday life is quite disheartening because, being told yesterday, I'm voting, I just want to vote to feel safe, whoever's going to make me feel safe. Knowing that that's not going to necessarily happen is really sad, because I think South Africa has come from a place where they've seen their vote translate to immediate direct change, whether it was in the 1990 referendum to end apartheid, or whether it was in the 1994 election to bring in a black party and to end racial segregation and bring in democracy. So I think that those kind of expectations still exist, where you live in a really rough area and you're hoping that by going to vote and lining up to vote that you're going to change what tomorrow looks like. And unfortunately, looking at the parties and looking at the political spectrum and how long these things take to actually take root and the structural constraints around them, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
OK, Yousra, thank you very much. It's an extraordinary story, so I wish you luck covering it in the coming days. That's it for the Sky News Daily with me, Mark Austin. And if you want the results, by the way, of the South African elections, they will be coming in the coming days. It takes quite a while, but if you stay tuned with all that, with the Sky News website, then you'll get those results. But for now, bye-bye.